I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you're unrolling this incredibly old, dust-covered architectural blueprint. And
Okay.
it's from over a century ago, right? The paper is super brittle, the ink is faded to that weird, that sepia color. And at first glance, the layout just looks totally bizarre.
Like a building that belongs in a completely different era.
Exactly. But then you start looking closer at the labels on the rooms, and you realize, with this sudden jolt, that this isn't a blueprint of some forgotten historical monument.
Right.
It's a blueprint of the exact societal structure you are living in right now. I mean, imagine a political thinker from over 100 years ago sitting down with a pen and paper and just perfectly predicting the exact debates we are having today.
It is a really startling realization when you see it.
It's wild. I'm talking about, the double burden of working mothers who are just exhausted from doing shifts at the office and then full shifts at home. I'm talking about the absolute burnout of modern dating and the fierce clash between what we now call, like, girl boss corporate feminism and the daily grinding struggles of the working class.
You really do expect history to feel distant, locked away in an archive somewhere. But when you read these texts, history isn't distant at all.
Not even a little bit.
It is holding up a very sharp, very unforgiving mirror to our contemporary lives. I mean, this thinker wasn't just predicting the debates we have on social media today. She was diagnosing the underlying structural causes of our exhaustion and doing it with a precision that makes you just stop in your tracks.
Which brings us to our deep dive today. We are exploring a truly fascinating stack of sources centered around a figure who is, well, she's as intellectually complex as she is historically monumental.
Definitely.
The collection we have is called Kollontai 150, Selected Writings of Alexandra Kollontai.
And it's a massive collection.
It is. This stack includes some brilliant introductory essays by modern scholars, Julia Camara, Andrea Francine Batista, and Atiliana da Silva Vicente Brunetto. And that's alongside the primary text, written by the Russian revolutionary herself.
Right. And these writings span a really massive transformational period. I mean, from 1909 all the way up to 1926.
Yeah. But before we go any further, I really need to put a giant flashing neon sign on this deep dive for you.
A very necessary disclaimer.
Exactly. Because these texts are deeply, deeply rooted in Marxist and communist ideology, and they were written right during the crucible of the Russian Revolution.
Right.
So I want to make it crystal clear to you, the listener, that we are not endorsing or taking sides on these politically charged viewpoints. We are essentially examining an architectural blueprint of society.
We are looking at the schematic.
Right. Our goal is not to advocate for moving into this building.
No, our role is entirely analytical here. We are treating these documents as vital historical artifacts and rigorous sociological theories.
Because that's what they are.
Exactly. We are here to understand the mechanics of her arguments, not to litigate their modern political viability.
So, our mission today is to unpack her worldview and understand the underlying logic of her original source material. We want to understand how Alexandra Kollontai, who, by the way, became the first woman in the world to serve as an official government cabinet member.
And the first female ambassador.
Yes. How she believed that true liberation was so much bigger than simply getting the right to vote. She believed it required a complete, ground-up restructuring of work, of motherhood, and even like the emotion of love itself.
And to understand those grand, sweeping macro theories of society, you simply cannot separate the theory from the theorist.
You really can't.
Her political philosophy was undeniably forged in the fires of her own intense personal contradictions. Her trajectory from the absolute heights of czarist privilege to the inner circles of the Bolshevik government is, well, it's the skeleton key to understanding her later writings.
Let's start right there, actually, with the woman herself. We're drawing from her 1926 autobiographical piece, which is beautifully titled The Aims and Worth of My Life.
It's a great title.
She wrote this looking back from her 50s, and the level of privilege she was born into in 1872 is just staggering. I mean, she was born into the old Russian landowning nobility.
Right, true aristocrats.
Yeah, she was the youngest, most coddled child in the family, raised on her Finnish grandfather's sprawling estate. She describes this environment where there was absolutely no luxury spared, but simultaneously no freedom.
Which makes sense when you look at the environment in late 19th century Tsarist Russia. It was incredibly tense.
Because of the assassinations.
Exactly. Following the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, The state cracked down heavily on liberal ideas
Mm.
on universities and the press.
They were terrified.
Her parents were absolutely terrified of this intellectual contagion. They looked at the schools, they saw the radical currents brewing among the youth, and they decided to just keep her in a gilded cage.
So no normal school for her.
None. They entirely shielded her from traditional schooling. They opted instead for private tutors to completely insulate her from any dangerous ideologies.
They essentially tried to put her in a socio-political clean room. They hired this private tutor, Marie Strakova, to give her an appropriately sanitized aristocratic education. But the irony here is just, it's delicious.
It really is the ultimate backfire.
Because this tutor they hired to protect her was basically patient zero for the revolutionary virus. Strakova was secretly tied to Russian revolutionary circles.
It is a profound historical irony. Instead of reading, docile aristocratic literature,
Yeah.
the young Kollontai was quietly being exposed to the subversive ideas of Russian populists and early socialists.
Right, under her parents' noses.
Exactly. Strakova provided the theoretical vocabulary, but the raw emotional catalyst for Kollontai's radicalization was already there, simply from observing the mechanics of her own privilege.
Yeah, she writes about looking out the window of that gilded cage on her grandfather's Finnish estate. She'd play with the peasant children who worked the land.
The contrast was stark.
It wasn't abstract to her at all. It was deeply sensory and painful. She had immense warmth, limitless food, safety, mountains of toys, and the kids she played with had rags, hunger, and absolutely nothing.
She couldn't reconcile it.
No, she developed this agonizing guilt over her own existence. It actually reminds me of a very modern phenomenon.
Oh. Like what?
Well, it's sort of like a modern Nepo baby, right? Someone born into immense wealth who suddenly wakes up and realizes the entire system is completely rigged to extract wealth from others just to fund their lifestyle.
That is actually a really perfect way to frame it.
And then they aggressively dedicate their life to dismantling their own trust fund.
She absolutely weaponized her privilege against the very system that generated it. But interestingly, the first target of her rebellion wasn't the czar or the factory owner.
He was much closer to home.
Yes, it was the immediate patriarchal structure of her own family. Her rebellion began with the expectations placed upon her as a woman of her class. Specifically, the expectation to secure the family's wealth through a quote-unquote good match.
Right. Her mother was desperate to marry her off to an adjutant to the czar.
A very strategic move.
Purely a marriage of convenience, a strategic merger of wealth and social capital. But Kollontai stubbornly rejected it.
She insisted on marrying for love.
Yeah, she chose an impoverished engineer instead. But this is where her autobiography takes a turn that I found completely mind-blowing.
Because of what happened after the marriage.
Right. Even when she achieved this personal victory, even when she married for love and completely defied her family, she found that the relationship itself quickly became a fetter.
The language she uses in the text is incredibly heavy. A fetter, a chain. She achieved the bourgeois ideal of marrying for love, yet she experienced it as a suffocating trap.
She describes being in love as fighting an eternal, exhausting, defensive war against the male ego.
That phrase is just so striking. An eternal defensive war.
It is. She felt her romantic relationship was literally siphoning her mental energy away from her work, her reading, and her political cause.
Yes.
She writes extensively about the squandering of our mental energy and the diminution of our labor power, which was dissipated in barren emotional experiences.
Which is fascinating because she is directly applying Marxist economic terms, labor power, squandering of resources, to the feeling of having an argument with her husband.
Exactly. That synthesis of economics and psychology is kind of her genius.
It really is. She realizes that the traditional structure of romance demands that the woman subsume her identity, her ambition, and her intellectual curiosity into the needs of the man.
The man attempts to impose his ego upon her.
Yes, to adapt her fully to his purposes. She writes that an inner rebellion would inevitably ensue within her. She would feel enslaved by the emotional demands of the relationship, tear herself away, and then rush back toward freedom.
Which, for her, meant returning to her political organizing. She actually preferred being alone, because alone meant being free to work.
Exactly.
But she didn't just write this off as her own bad luck in dating. She didn't say, like, oh, I just have an avoidant attachment style, or I just picked the wrong guy.
No, she went much bigger than that.
She looked at this exhausting tug of war between maintaining her own identity and the demands of love, and she diagnosed it as a structural failure of society.
Right.
She stated that her entire generation of women simply did not know how to harmoniously balance work and love because the system wasn't built to allow it.
And this deeply intimate personal exhaustion becomes the psychological bedrock for her later macro-political theories. She begins to view emotional energy not as some, endless magical wellspring, but as a finite material resource.
It is literally a form of labor power.
Yes. And under the current system, she argues, society forces women to squander that invaluable labor power in private, isolating emotional dramas rather than harnessing it for the collective good.
It's such a brilliant pivot. She takes the burnout of her own dating and marital life and transforms it into a foundational critique of capitalism and patriarchy.
It's incredible.
But, while she was theorizing about the mechanics of love, she knew that to change any of it, she first had to change the material reality of the masses.
Because individual rebellion wasn't going to topple the system.
Exactly. She needed mass mobilization. And that shift from individual defiance to mass organizing leads us directly to a massive global event she helped shape, an event that has been heavily sanitized over the last century.
You're talking about International Women's Day.
I am. To understand the raw, radical roots of this holiday, we rely on her 1920 essay, International Women's Day, a militant celebration.
Bolstered by the historical context provided by Batista and Brunetto in our sources.
Right. And the contrast between the origins of this day and its current corporate iteration is just incredibly stark.
It is genuinely jarring. Today, International Women's Day is often characterized by, brands posting polite pastel graphics on social media.
Using buzzwords like empowerment.
Right. And maybe offering a 15% discount on cosmetics. But looking at the timeline provided in these texts, the origins are steeped in sweatshops, starvation, and militant class warfare.
And surprisingly, at least to me, the timeline doesn't actually begin in Russia.
No, the earliest recognizable iteration of Women's Day actually emerged in the United States.
Wow.
In 1909, U.S. socialists organized massive demonstrations across the country. And we have to look at the material conditions of the time, right? This is the era of brutal, unregulated garment factories.
The sweatshops.
Exactly. Primarily staffed by immigrant women working 12 to 14-hour days in locked, hazardous conditions. They weren't marching for abstract empowerment.
They were striking for baseline survival.
Yes, demanding labor rights, shorter hours, and the political vote to enforce those rights.
So that American militancy crosses the Atlantic the following year. In 1910, at the Second International Conference of Working Women, Clara Zetkin, who is this towering figure in the German socialist movement and a close ally of Kollontai, proposes making this an international day of action.
Right.
And the very first official International Women's Day is celebrated on March 19th, 1911.
And Clara Zetkin's choice of March 19th was highly deliberate and deeply symbolic.
Why that specific day?
She chose it to commemorate the 1848 Prussian working class uprising. During that revolution, the armed populace of Berlin fought on the barricades, physically shedding blood to force the Prussian monarchy to make democratic concessions.
Including the promise of female suffrage, right?
Yes, a promise the monarch later broke, of course. But by tethering Women's Day to the 1848 barricades, Zetkin and Kollontai were explicitly signaling that women's liberation was inextricably linked to armed working-class revolt.
Okay, so wait, let me make sure I have this straight. If the Americans and the Germans started this holiday to fight for voting rights and to commemorate a Prussian uprising, how did it become so deeply intertwined with the Russian Revolution?
That's the big question.
And why do we celebrate it on March 8th today instead of March 19th?
The shift happens because of the unique, explosive conditions in Tsarist Russia. In Western Europe and America, the strategy largely revolved around putting pressure on bourgeois parliaments.
Demanding the legal right to vote within an existing democratic or semi-democratic framework.
Exactly. But in Russia, there was no functioning democratic parliament to reform. They were living under an absolute autocracy.
So there's no ballot box to drop a vote into.
None. When Russian women celebrated the day for the first time in 1913, they couldn't just march down the street with placards. They faced severe Tsarist repression, the secret police, and the threat of exile to Siberia.
So they had to do it secretly.
Yes, they had to organize in the shadows, holding illegal underground meetings. It was an absolute pressure cooker of political tension.
And that pressure cooker was subjected to the ultimate catalyst, which was the outbreak of the First World War.
The war changed everything.
By 1917, the Russian Empire was just bleeding out. The economy had completely collapsed under the strain of total war. The supply chains are shattered. Trains weren't running, which meant grain couldn't reach the cities.
The industrial centers, particularly Petrograd, were literally starving.
Which brings us to the tipping point. March 8, 1917, or February 23rd, if you're going by the old Julian calendar the Russians used at the time.
Right.
The women of Petrograd, the weavers, the textile workers, the wives of soldiers dying on the Eastern Front, they had simply reached the limit of human endurance.
You have to picture the scene.
They were standing in sub-zero temperatures in bread lines for 40 hours a week, only to be told there was no flour.
It's unimaginable.
They didn't strike over parliamentary procedure. They struck over visceral, undeniable, material reality.
The slogans they chanted were immediate and absolute: bread for our children, and return of our husbands from the trenches. They spontaneously poured out of the factories and into the streets.
Just a massive wave of people.
And what is crucial here is the sheer scale and audacity of the action. They completely defied the authorities, and they even surprised the male Bolshevik organizers, who actually thought a strike was premature at that moment.
Yeah, tens of thousands of desperate, freezing, furious women formed this stormy sea of anger. The imagery is staggering. The Tsarist security forces, the police, the Cossacks, they were completely paralyzed.
Because they were trained to put down political agitators.
Right, but they didn't know how to violently suppress tens of thousands of starving mothers demanding bread. The sheer mass of the women's revolt broke the psychological hold of the autocracy.
It absolutely did. The women's strike acted as the spark that ignited the entire city. The male workers from the massive Putilov metalworks joined them. Within days, the military garrisons mutinied and refused to fire on the crowds. This spontaneous uprising by working-class women was the direct trigger for the February Revolution, which ultimately toppled the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty.
And because of the monumental world historical impact of that specific strike, International Women's Day was permanently moved to March 8th to honor them.
Exactly. As Kollontai wrote, the women raised the torch of revolution.
Okay, so the Tsar is overthrown. Eventually, the Bolsheviks take state power in October 1917, and one of their early acts is granting women equal civil rights and the right to vote.
Yes, very early on.
So in Russia, the original stated goal of the international holiday getting the franchise is achieved. Does Kollontai say, great, we won, let's turn Women's Day into a day of rest and celebration?
Far from it. Kollontai 1920 essay outlines a massive pivot. Once the working class seized state power, the function of the holiday had to transform entirely.
Because the enemy changed.
Precisely. It was no longer a day of protest against an oppressive state. It became a day of mobilization to build a new proletarian state. She called this conquering the bloodless labor front.
Rebuilding a country that had been economically obliterated by World War I, followed immediately by a brutal civil war.
Yes, the infrastructure was in ruins. The holiday became an urgent call to action. They needed women to step into non-traditional roles to literally keep the country alive.
To rebuild the shattered train systems.
To repair the steam engines, to run the factories while the men were fighting the white armies. The rhetoric of the day shifted from demanding rights to demanding labor participation to secure the fragile new society.
It is just incredible how history gets smoothed out. I mean, the next time you see a corporate email offering a discount code on shoes to quote-unquote celebrate women, remember the actual roots.
It wasn't about discounts.
No. This day was forged in illegal underground meetings, cemented by desperate women standing in freezing breadlines whose spontaneous militant strikes literally brought down an empire.
Historical progress is almost never polite.
It is never freely handed down by those in power. It is fought for, usually at immense personal cost.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, as they began this monumental task of rebuilding the economy, a massive ideological fracture was exposed.
Oh, this is the part that really surprised me.
When Kollontai looked at the global women's movement, she realized that the woman working the textile loom and the wealthy suffragette fundamentally disagreed on what the new world should look like.
This is a major point of friction in her worldview, and one that directly challenges a lot of modern mainstream feminism. She didn't believe that all women should unite together.
Not at all.
In her 1909 text, The Social Basis of the Women's Question, she takes a sledgehammer to the idea of universal sisterhood. She bluntly argues that there is no such thing as a single unifying women's question.
To Kollontai, the concept of a unified sisterhood transcending class lines was a dangerous bourgeois myth.
A myth. Wow.
Yes, she analyzed society strictly through the lens of historical materialism. She divided the women's movement into two irreconcilable camps: the bourgeois women, which was the wealthy, property-owning class, and the proletarian women, the working class.
And she didn't think they could work together.
No, her argument was that their daily realities, their ultimate objectives, and the tactics required to achieve those objectives were fundamentally incompatible.
Let's break down how she defined these two camps, because it's fascinating. According to Kollontai, the bourgeois women were fighting for the freedom to work.
Right.
But in 1909, what did that actually mean? They weren't fighting for the right to work in a coal mine.
Obviously not.
They wanted access to universities. They wanted to break into prestigious professional careers like law, medicine, and academia. And they wanted the political right to vote.
But Kollontai argues they wanted these rights primarily to protect their own property and consolidate their own wealth within the existing capitalist framework.
Conversely, she points to the material reality of the proletarian women. These women did not need to fight for the freedom to work. They had been forced into the grueling, dangerous industrial workforce for decades.
Their version of work was brutal.
Yeah, their version of work meant losing fingers in textile looms, breathing in toxic chemicals in match factories, working 14-hour shifts just to afford basic rations.
The working woman wasn't fighting for a prestigious career. She was fighting to survive the exploitation of the capitalist system itself.
And she brings intense statistical receipts to back this up, proving that working women are a massive, indispensable engine of the global economy.
The numbers are really striking.
In her 1909 text, she cites that there were 27 million women working in manufacturing across the industrialized world. She specifically highlights Austria, noting that women workers actually outnumbered men in the workforce.
Right.
It was 5 million women to 4.4 million men.
And she uses these statistics to deliver a crushing critique of bourgeois equality. She asks this really profound question: what good is it to promise a proletarian woman equality with men under the current system?
Because the men are suffering too.
Exactly. If you make a female factory worker perfectly equal to a male factory worker, they are both still starving. They are both still exploited. And they are both still having their surplus labor extracted by the factory owner.
Equality within an exploitative system is just equal exploitation.
Precisely.
I think the best way to clarify her theory is to apply it to a very modern scenario. It is the fundamental difference between a wealthy female CEO fighting to break the glass ceiling so she can get a seat on the board of a Fortune 500 company versus the female janitor who comes in at midnight to clean that exact same boardroom.
That is an excellent translation of her argument. The material interests of those two women are in direct opposition.
Right. Because modern corporate feminism often points to the female CEO and says, look, a woman is in charge. This is a victory for all women. The ceiling is broken.
But Kollontai would look at that and say, absolutely not.
Because the CEO's fiduciary duty is to maximize corporate profits. And how does she do that? By keeping the janitor's wages as low as possible, by cutting her healthcare benefits, and by denying her a union. The fact that they share a gender does not magically erase the fact that one woman's wealth is directly predicated on the other woman's exploitation.
Kollontai explicitly warned proletarian women not to be distracted by the idealistic phraseology of bourgeois feminists.
She saw it as a trap.
She did.
Yeah.
She believed that if the bourgeois women won their demands, if they got the vote and entered the professions, they would merely use those new instruments of power to further oppress their working-class sisters.
Wow.
The bourgeois woman wanted to reform the house to get a better room in it, but the proletarian woman needed to demolish the house and build a new one entirely.
So if the path of mainstream feminism, getting the vote, leaning into corporate structures, if that isn't the answer, how did Kollontai and the early Soviet state actually plan to liberate working women?
They needed a new blueprint.
Right. Because if you're going to tear down the house, you need a blueprint for the new one. And in her introductory essay, the scholar Julia Kamara brilliantly distills Kollontai's blueprint into 3 core pillars of emancipation.
These 3 pillars represent the practical, systemic interventions the Soviet state attempted to implement under her influence.
Let's go through them.
The first pillar is economic independence. But this wasn't just about the right to work. It was about seamlessly integrating women into the productive national economy, so they were no longer financially dependent on a husband or father.
But if you mandate that women must enter the factories and the fields to achieve economic independence, you immediately hit a massive biological brick wall.
Who is watching the kids?
Exactly. You can't demand a woman work a 10-hour shift in a factory if she also has 10 hours of unpaid caregiving and domestic labor waiting for her at home.
Which is why her first pillar was inextricably linked to the second pillar, maternity rights. Kollontai was acutely aware of what later sociologists would call the double burden.
The crushing, inescapable exhaustion of doing a shift at work and a shift at home.
Her solution was not to ask husbands to help out more around the house, which is often the modern advice.
Right.
Her solution was to fundamentally socialize motherhood.
And the policies they drafted over a century ago are genuinely staggering, especially considering the Soviet economy was practically non-existent after the Civil War.
They were very ambitious.
They guaranteed 16 weeks of fully paid maternity leave. They provided free state-funded packages of basic food and hygiene products, milk, butter, diapers for nursing mothers.
And perhaps most radically, in 1920, the USSR became the first country in modern history to legalize abortion.
Yes, that is a huge point.
It is crucial to note the specific mechanics and framing of this legalization. As objective observers of the text, we see that Kollontai and the state did not frame abortion primarily as an abstract issue of bodily autonomy.
How did they frame it?
As a dire economic and health necessity. The material conditions were catastrophic. There was widespread famine.
People were starving.
Forcing a working-class woman to bear a child she could not afford to feed in a society that could barely feed its adult workforce was viewed as detrimental to the physical survival of the woman and an unsustainable drain on the collective society.
It was a pragmatic removal of the biological penalty of being a woman in the workforce.
Exactly. It was about making sure biology didn't trap women in poverty.
But even with maternity leave and healthcare, there is still the daily grind of keeping a human being alive, right? Cooking, cleaning, washing clothes.
Which leads us to the third and most structurally disruptive pillar, ending domestic slavery.
Kollontai viewed the traditional isolated family model, where millions of individual wives stood in millions of private kitchens, cooking millions of individual pots of soup, as the most spectacularly inefficient and oppressive economic structure imaginable.
She called it domestic slavery.
Yeah, because it chained women's labor power to unproductive, repetitive tasks that benefited only the immediate family unit rather than the national economy.
Her solution was to completely abolish that isolation. She wanted to physically rip the unpaid chores out of the private home and industrialize them in the public sphere.
We're talking about state-run communal kitchens, massive public laundries, and state-operated nurseries.
The logistics of this were wild to think about.
You don't cook dinner for your husband in your tiny apartment. You both go down to the communal dining hall. You don't spend Sundays scrubbing his shirts. You drop them off at the public laundry facility.
The goal was to liberate millions of hours of female labor power. If the state takes over the cooking and cleaning, the woman's energy is freed up.
So she can participate fully in economic production, attend political meetings, and engage in cultural education.
Exactly. But this push to socialize the biological and domestic realities of women highlights a major philosophical divergence between Kollontai and some contemporary feminist frameworks.
Oh, this is the part about equality versus equalization. This concept completely upended my understanding of early feminist theory.
It is a profound distinction. Kollontai actively and vocally opposed the concept of absolute, unnuanced equality between men and women in the workplace.
Which sounds backward at first.
It does. But she argued that demanding blind, identical equality was actually a trap because it required ignoring undeniable material biological realities, specifically menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding.
She argued that if you put a pregnant woman on a factory floor and demand she work the exact same quotas under the exact same conditions as a biological male, you are not treating her equally.
You are committing systemic violence against her body.
Yes. You are forcing her to conform to a male baseline that ignores her physiological reality.
Precisely. The capitalist demand for blind equality was just a way to squeeze maximum labor out of female bodies without paying the cost of accommodating their physiological needs.
So what does she demand instead?
Instead of equality, Kollontai demanded what she termed equalization and special rights. Women should undertake work of equal value to the collective, but they must be protected by a robust framework of special rights, maternity leave, nursing breaks, lighter duties during pregnancy, that specifically accommodated their biological roles.
To her, true equity meant recognizing difference, not erasing it. It is
Yeah.
such a provocative stance. She essentially says that the male body should not be the default metric for a worker.
Which is a very modern debate we're still having today.
Exactly. But, as radical as it was to socialize the laundry, the kitchen, and maternity itself, Kollontai realized it wasn't enough.
No.
You can build all the communal dining halls in the world, but if the fundamental emotional architecture between people remains rooted in possession, jealousy, and inequality, true liberation is impossible.
Which brings us to her most philosophically ambitious and arguably most difficult theoretical leap. She realized she had to socialize the heart.
Socialize the heart.
Yes, she sought to resolve that agonizing, exhausting tension she felt in her own youth, the war between personal intimacy and public duty. And to understand this, we must dive deeply into her 1923 letter addressed to working youth, titled Make Way for Winged Eros.
To really grasp this text, we have to look at the timeline. It is 1923. The Soviet state has barely survived a catastrophic civil war. They're dealing with widespread famine, and they're desperately trying to electrify and industrialize a massive agrarian empire.
It was a time of immense, desperate struggle.
Right. And amidst all of this existential state building, Kollontai writes a theoretical letter about how young people are dating.
I know.
I have to admit, reading this, I was genuinely skeptical. Why on earth is a high-ranking government official dedicating precious intellectual bandwidth to analyzing the romantic lives of 20-somethings? It feels like a massive misallocation of political resources.
Your skepticism is completely understandable. And it mirrors the pushback she received from some of her male Bolshevik colleagues who thought love was a trivial, private matter.
How did she answer them?
She answers this by completely dismantling the premise that love is merely a private, biological feeling. She separates the raw reproductive instinct, which is biological, from love.
Okay.
She argues that love, the rules surrounding it, the expectations, the way it is expressed, the psychology of it, is a profoundly social and historical factor.
She basically argues that you can't build a communist economy if people are still practicing capitalist love.
Exactly. But before she introduces her solution, she diagnoses the immediate problem. She observes that the Soviet youth of 1923 are going through a sexual crisis.
What kind of crisis?
Well, during the brutal years of the Civil War, people only had the capacity for what she calls wingless eros.
Wingless eros is such a stark, evocative term.
It is. She defines it as the purely physical, unadorned sexual instinct.
Yeah.
It is physical release completely stripped of emotional entanglement, romantic courtship, or psychological depth.
It's essentially a strings-free hookup born out of absolute desperation.
Yes, and she doesn't judge the youth for this. She explains it through material conditions. During the Revolution and the Civil War, everyday life was a matter of sheer survival. People were dodging bullets, freezing, and starving.
They literally had to conserve every ounce of their psychological and emotional energy for the political struggle and for staying alive.
They simply could not afford the sleepless nights, the anxiety, and the massive emotional drain of a deep, complicated romance. Wingless eros consumed the least amount of inner strength.
It was an emotional survival mechanism. But by 1923, the Civil War is largely over. The new economic policy has stabilized things slightly. There is a temporary calm.
Right.
And Kollontai observes that because the youth aren't in constant survival mode, they are slowly returning to winged eros.
Which she defines as love woven with complex emotions, spiritual connection, friendship, passion, and psychological depth.
So she writes this letter to help them navigate this return to emotional complexity.
And this is where she proves to her skeptics that love is a matter of state importance. She expertly synthesizes a sweeping historical timeline to demonstrate that every single economic system, every ruling class throughout human history, has meticulously manipulated the concept of love to serve its own specific material and economic interests.
This historical breakdown is absolutely fascinating. I want to walk through her eras because it proves her point perfectly.
Let's do it.
She starts with the tribal era. In the earliest prehistoric kinship communities, what was the highest idealized form of love?
In the tribal era, the highest form of love was not romantic or sexual at all. It was love for one's blood relations. The survival of the fragile tribe depended entirely on absolute kinship loyalty.
Because the environment was so hostile.
Exactly. The tribe needed individuals who would sacrifice themselves for their siblings or elders. She uses the Greek myth of Antigone as the prime example.
Oh, right.
Antigone is considered a legendary hero because she risked the wrath of the king, and ultimately her own life, to bury her brother.
If Antigone had defied the king, just to save a husband or a romantic lover, the ancient tribal audience wouldn't have cared as much. The biological family was the economic unit of survival.
Correct.
So then society evolves into the ancient world, the era of city-states like Sparta and Athens. The economic and military needs shift. The ideal of love shifts. What did they value?
The city-states were in constant warfare, relying on hoplite phalanxes and military discipline. Therefore, the highest idealized love was civic friendship and absolute loyalty between men, specifically between citizens and brothers in arms.
Because the survival of the state depended on men standing shoulder to shoulder in battle.
Exactly. She cites the mythological friendship of Castor and Pollux. In this era, intense romantic love for a woman was actually viewed with deep suspicion.
It was seen as a distraction, right?
Yes, a weakness that pulled a man's loyalty away from the state and the military unit.
A hero risked his life for his shield brother, not his wife. Then we move forward centuries to the feudal era. Knights, castles, the Middle Ages. The economics are based on land ownership and vassalage.
Yes.
And this is where the societal manipulation of love becomes incredibly explicit and, frankly, kind of wild. What was the ideal love under feudalism?
The ideal was chivalrous, courtly love.
Nah.
But the crucial mechanism of courtly love was that it was almost entirely directed at an inaccessible woman.
Like a queen.
Yes, very often the wife of the knight's lord or a queen. It was a highly formalized spiritual devotion to a woman the knight could never physically possess.
At first glance, that makes no sense. Why would a society idealize loving someone you are legally and physically barred from having?
Because of the economics.
Right. When you explain the mechanics of the feudal system, it is a stroke of manipulative genius.
It was a brilliantly effective psychological tool.
Yeah.
The ruling class, the lords and kings, needed a constant supply of knights to perform incredible, suicidal feats of bravery in constant territorial battles.
But knights were usually second sons with no land.
Exactly. And you couldn't always pay them enough gold to convince them to die.
Yeah.
So the system created this spiritual, platonic love for an unattainable lady as a psychological lever.
So the knight fought, bled, and died not for land, but to win the purely spiritual favor and a token like a scarf from the queen.
Yes.
The ruling class essentially institutionalized the friend zone as a military strategy.
That is a very modern but very accurate way to put it.
They extracted maximum military labor from these knights by paying them in the currency of spiritual romance, all without disrupting the actual property lines, arranged marriages, and bloodlines that held feudal wealth together.
It is incredibly cynical and brilliant.
Which brings us to the system Kollontai was actively trying to destroy. The bourgeois capitalist era. How did capitalism redefine love?
The bourgeoisie orchestrated a massive ideological shift. For the first time in history, bourgeois ideology took physical, sexual desire, and spiritual love and forcibly fused them together.
But crucially, it strictly confined that fused love within the rigid boundaries of monogamous legal marriage.
And why did capitalism need love to equal marriage? Because of property.
Ah.
The bourgeois family is fundamentally an economic unit built for the accumulation and protection of capital. If you are hoarding wealth, you need to know exactly who your legitimate heirs are so you can pass that wealth down safely.
Therefore, female fidelity becomes paramount.
Yes, and love must be rigidly channeled into the marital structure to ensure the safe transfer of property.
The capitalist class needed the husband and wife to be an isolated, highly cooperative economic unit. They needed strong emotional bonds to keep the nuclear family stable so they could hoard their capital and defend it against market competitors.
The home became a private fortress.
And this is where Kollontai delivers her ultimate, devastating critique. She looks at this bourgeois ideal, the all-consuming, exclusive soulmate love between two people, the us-against-the-world mentality that we still heavily romanticize today. And she argues that it is actually profoundly selfish and actively destructive to the broader society.
She argues it is destructive because it acts as an emotional vacuum.
An emotional vacuum? What does she mean by that?
It creates a closed, impenetrable circuit of emotion. Under the bourgeois ideal, all of your sympathy, all of your mental energy, all of your devotion gets poured exclusively into this one other person or your immediate nuclear children.
And what's wrong with that?
By doing so, you withdraw your emotional energy and empathy from the community, from your neighbors, from the collective. The intense emotional wealth of the couple creates emotional poverty for the society.
Wow. Us against the world literally means you are treating the rest of the world as an afterthought. Kollontai says a communist society cannot survive if everyone retreats into their private emotional fortresses. So, what is her alternative? If tribal love was kinship and bourgeois love is monogamous property, what is the proletarian ideal of love?
She proposes a radically new emotional architecture that she calls love comradeship.
Love comradeship.
Yes, the fundamental goal of love comradeship is to ensure that emotional energy is not hoarded in isolation, but is generated and allowed to radiate outward to strengthen the social fabric.
How does that actually work in practice? She wasn't just speaking in abstract. She laid out 3 specific psychological rules for cultivating love comradeship. What is rule number 1?
The first rule is total equality. There can be no masculine egoism and no slavish suppression of the female personality.
The relationship must be a union of 2 truly equal, independent individuals.
Yes, this directly targets the exhausting defensive war she experienced in her own marriage.
Rule number 2, no property rights over the other person's soul.
This is a direct assault on the capitalist mindset that bleeds into romantic behavior. It is the rejection of the idea that you own your partner.
Which is such a common trope in romance. You're mine, I'm yours.
Precisely. She demands the eradication of possessiveness and the intense, destructive jealousy that stems from treating another human being as a piece of private property. You must mutually recognize the absolute integrity and freedom of the other's personality.
And rule number 3, which might be the most difficult, comradely sensitivity.
Comradely sensitivity is the active, cultivated ability to truly listen, to empathize, and to deeply understand the inner workings and psychological needs of the person you love.
Empathy as a practice.
Yes. Under the bourgeois system, this intense emotional labor was almost exclusively demanded of the woman, while the man was allowed to be emotionally obtuse. In love comradeship, this demanding emotional labor is mutual and required from both partners.
So if you manage to achieve this, if you build a relationship based on true equality, zero possessiveness, and deep mutual empathy, how does that actually help the state? Kollontai believes that if you train yourself to love this way, the emotional bonds don't just stay trapped inside the bedroom.
Exactly. Her thesis is that love is a training ground for social behavior.
Oh, that's beautiful.
By cultivating these qualities, learning how to be truly empathetic, supportive, and fiercely equal without being possessive, you fundamentally rewire your own psychology. You become a better, more sensitive, more cooperative person in every aspect of your life.
Those sympathetic feelings inevitably radiate outward.
Yes. Because you have learned to treat your partner with profound comradely respect, you begin to treat your neighbors, your coworkers, and your fellow citizens with that same comradely respect.
The deep love you practice in private acts as a generator that strengthens the solidarity of the entire societal collective.
It is a staggering, beautiful, and incredibly demanding vision of human potential.
She is saying that the way we love each other shouldn't be a retreat from the harshness of the world. It should be the very mechanism by which we train ourselves to make the world better.
It is a philosophy that attempts to resolve that agonizing tension she felt throughout her life. It merges the personal need for intimacy with the public duty to the collective, ensuring that love no longer squanders labor power, but replenishes it.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive, and back to you, the listener. We have traced an unbelievable historical and intellectual arc today.
We really have.
We started with a privileged aristocrat who felt the agonizing guilt of inequality simply by looking out the window of a Finnish estate. We saw her weaponize that privilege, moving from individual rebellion against an arranged marriage to mass political organizing.
Helping to forge the militant, fiery working-class roots of International Women's Day on the freezing streets of Petrograd.
We examined her unyielding, controversial critique of mainstream feminism. Her insistence that material class reality dictates our lives far more than shared gender.
And her radical, logistical blueprints to socialize the crushing burdens of motherhood, kitchens, and domestic labor.
And finally, we unpacked her most profound psychological theory, that love itself is a social construct, meticulously molded by the economic system of the day.
That's a lot to process.
It is. And this brings us right back to that blueprint we talked about at the beginning. Whether you are currently dealing with the crushing double burden of managing a demanding career while doing a second shift of caregiving at home,
or whether you are just feeling completely hollowed out by the transactional nature of modern dating.
Kollontai's century-old writings are asking you to consider something deeply uncomfortable. She is asking you to consider how much of your personal, intimate, emotional life is actually being dictated by the economic system you are trapped inside.
She forces us to ask the ultimate question. Are our desires, our exhaustions, and our ideals of romance truly our own, or are they the engineered products of the societal architecture we inhabit?
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. If Kollontai believed, and history strongly suggests she was right, that every economic system designs a specific type of love to serve its own needs, what does the current era of algorithm-driven dating apps say about late-stage capitalism?
That is a deeply chilling question to consider.
Think about the mechanics of it. In our swipe right culture of instant gratification, where human beings are presented on a screen as an endless, frictionless catalog of consumable options, are we being conditioned into a new, highly digitized, hyper-capitalist form of wingless eros?
It really feels like it.
Are we being trained to accept a version of love that requires minimal emotional investment, maximizes our individual isolation, and perfectly serves an economy that thrives on endless, lonely, unfulfilled consumption?
That's a terrifying thought.
And if that is true, what is the revolutionary potential of logging off, rejecting the algorithm, and actively reclaiming deep, complicated, fiercely equal, we-need connection today?
It suggests that in an economy built on isolation and consumption, the simple, demanding act of truly knowing and supporting another person without treating them as a consumable product might be the most radical political action you can take.
So the next time you feel burned out by the grind or exhausted by the dating scene, remember that dust-covered blueprint. The ink might be faded, the language might be a century old, but the walls it describes are the exact walls you're standing inside right now. It might just be time to start thinking about a remodel.